Greetings students, and today we'll be focusing on diversity of plants and sexual reproduction in angiosperms. We have different types of plants, hence we have them as a diversity, and they are classified according to 5 different groups. We have seed plants which bear seeds to reproduce. An example would be a sunflower. We have ferns which reproduce through spores. They have openings which allow them to reproduce. Thirdly, we have lycophytes that also reproduce through spores. We have horsetails which also reproduce through spores. Their elongation helps them to reproduce as well. And then lastly, we have bryophytes. They also reproduce through spores. Usually bryophytes, you can find them if you have a paving and it's usually moist. Bryophytes tend to grow there. Angiosperms are divided into groups, which is dicotyledon and monotyledon. Dicotyledon, di means two, cotyledon means a seed lobe. Dicotyledon in essence means that plants have 2 seed lobes. If we look at seed beans, for example, or bean seeds, for example, they have 2 different lobes which can be used to for growth underground and for growth above the ground. So if it's planted, one is gonna go down the root. Obviously there's gonna be a root canal that's gonna go underneath the soil, and then there's another lobe which is gonna go up above the soil. And then monocotyledon, mono means one, cotyledon we already explained that it means the seed lobe. In essence, it means that these plants have only 1 seed lobe. If we look at maize seeds, they only have 1 seed lobe, which is like one sort of like opening. Plants are useful for people. As people, we use plants for different uses. So I'd like us to take 30 seconds to just reflect on how plants are used, as how we people use plants. I want us to look at, like, take a minute to think about how plants are used as food and beverages, which plants are used as food and beverages, or which plants are manufactured to make food and beverages. I want us to also think about which plants are used um, to make medicine. I want us to also think about plants which are used as soaps and cosmetics. I want you to also think about plants which are used in weaving and basketry. I also want you guys to reflect on plants which can be used for decoration. Sexual reproduction in angiosperms, right? Flowers produce seeds in order to reproduce. I'm sure by now we all know that. The purpose of a flower, if we look at the outer layer of the flower, it is to attract pollinators, it is to be a host for fertilization, it is to create fruit, it is to produce seeds, right? The flower is the reproductive organ of the angiosperm. Some flowers are tiny, some are strange, others are magnificently beautiful, and all these different characteristics or different um, build up of flowers, they all serve a different purpose and a specific purpose. We know that by now. I want you guys to know that a flower has a male and a female part, that hence they can reproduce. They also have we also know that sperm forms in the male parts, and ova, which is the egg, forms in the female parts, right? Pollination and fertilization, right? So for fertilization to occur, there are certain steps that must happen. Number one, pollination must occur. From there, fertilization must occur. Seeds must form, and seeds must germinate and form new plants. How? Let us look at how pollination occurs. After the flower has matured, sperm forms in the anther and ova form in the ovary. The sperm must then get to the ovum. Pollination only occurs once the male sperm reaches the stigma. Pollination can only happen between the same species. One flower, however, cannot pollinate itself. This is something we must know. Once the pollen reaches the stigma and starts to germinate, the process of pollination ends. Right. Pollination is carried out through different, I would say, different factors or different um, aid. I would say aid is something that is it. There are certain things that help pollination to occur or to carry out pollination. Number one, we have wind, we have water, and we have animals, right? Wind and water help move pollen from flower to flower. Animals that help plants pollinate are called pollinators. Animals such as insects, birds, mice, and birds play a huge role in pollination. But we must remember that if there is no pollination, then there is no seeds and fruit, right? Which means that there will be no food for humans or animals. This now means that we must think about some of the bugs or some of the insects we actually kill or squash, because they also play a role in making sure that the ecosystem is in balance and that we as humans and animals have food, right? Plants are adapted for pollination. I want us to also take 30 seconds to reflect on how different plants are adapted for pollination. Um, we can look at different structures of plants, the small ones, the big ones, the ones with flowers, the ones which do not have flowers. Let's look at all those categories and try to think how these different plants are adapted for pollination, since, well, there are different types of pollination or factors that contribute to pollination, such as wind, water, and animals. Let's try to think about that. And once we are done, we can now look at this slide, right? Plants are adapted for wind pollination. Many grasses and pine trees have low hanging light, feathery stigmas hanging out. Very often, these flowers have no scent and rely on the wind to catch grains. Plants are also adapted for water pollination. These plants often have separate male and female flowers. Pollen is released and floats. Female flowers tend to bend over the water so the stigma can trap the floating pollen. Plants are adapted for animal pollination. Bees are the most important pollinators. They are attracted to sweet smells. Large grains of pollen attach to the bee, excuse me, as they dig for nectar. Some birds enjoy the nectar for energy. They are attracted to red flowers, which is a color insects cannot see. By now, we know that insects have certain colors which they cannot see or identify. Here, we are told that red is one of them. Most red flowers are pollinated by birds. Birds and mice are other common pollinators. Step by step of fertilization. Pollination occurs once ripe pollen has landed on a ripe stigma. Each pollen grain has two male sex cells. Once the pollen reaches the ovary, it pushes into the embryo sac. One of the male cells fertilizes the egg, forming a zygote. The other becomes the endosperm, which will provide nourishment, which is the food for the growing cell. The zygotes divide into little cells called an embryo. The endosperm surrounds it, providing the nourishment. The actual ovule then becomes a seed. While the seed forms, the ovary enlarges into a fruit which carries seeds. If we look at the below diagram, we can see step by step of how pollination occurs. Right. Let us then look at seed germination. Once what we said once fertilization occurs, then we're going to have a seed. So we want to see how then the seed germinates, right? Seeds can survive the cold and other harsh conditions by entering a dormant state. Once conditions are right, the seed will start to grow. The best conditions for germination are the correct amount of water, oxygen, light, and warmth. Once a seed starts to grow, it is called germination. Germination also has different stages. Usually it goes through 4 to 5 different stages, right? I want us to discuss these 5 different stages, or I want us to take 30 minutes to reflect on the stages before we can discuss on them. This is your reflection activity, and I want you guys to state the life cycle of a plant, which is the process of germination or seed germination. We have come to the end of our session. We have come to the end of our lesson. If you are able to reach this far, congratulations. I'll obviously be seeing people who did engage up until the last slide. Thank you. And next up, we'll be seeing you will be engaging with your reflection activity.